Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for this morning, and we invite your presence into this study. We ask, Lord, that you can help the computer to work properly and our minds to work properly as well. Help us to understand the things that we're going to study, and we ask for your leading and guiding in our lives as well as in this study. Be with each person. Help us to share the truth and to reveal your character. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning, everyone. So, since my other computer is not working at the moment, I'm not sure why. I'm going to go to the whiteboard. Just do a little bit of review of these lines. Okay. So if we go back to 606, we're going to have in Revelation 9, this is going to be the falling star. And we're equating this in a symbolic way with the black rock, or the black stone, I guess it's called, that's placed in the Kaaba in Mecca. But really the falling star is Muhammad. And it's him placing this black stone that's going to be connected to what the pioneers understood as the imposture. Now, his first vision is going to be in 610, and then his flight in 622, flight from Mecca, and then he's going to die in 632. And I placed this period of 150 years here, which is 5 months. And 5 months is also the time of the desert locust, that it thrives. So some people have equated this with the symbol of the locusts. We also know here that locusts don't have a king, even though there's this period of 5 months. And this is going to end in 782 with the Treaty of Constantinople. Just say it's the first treaty of Constantinople. And then we have this period going up to 1299 that was variously divided as 908, which would be 126 years and 391 years, or it could be 391 years and 1173 and 126 years. This is July 27th and is going to begin a period of 5 months, 150 years, ending in 1449. And the date here, this is a Julian date. July 27th here is a Gregorian date. So this is basically the line of where we've worked up to so far. The biblical date, of course, here is the 26th day of the 4th month. And the Julian date here is July 18. But back when I originally looked at the 26th day of the 4th month in 1449, I was only looking at the Julian date. And so I didn't really think that that was significant. Now, we did talk about the fact that when we look at this period of 150 years and 391, which we sort of addressed the beginning of this, but not the end of it, that this ends up being a period of 541 years. And it's from July 27th, which is a Julian date, which is the 26th day of the fourth month, to July 27th Gregorian, which is also the 26th day of the fourth month. But this is in 1840. And so the thing that you can see here is July 27th Gregorian is the 26th day of the fourth month in 1449. So this point, I didn't notice till later. I didn't notice that in 2015. I was just counting from here to here in 2015. And that's how Lich counts. He adds these two periods together. He doesn't look for an event on July 27th or July 18th, which he wouldn't have done, in 1449. He doesn't look for an event on that date. He just looks for the fact that this begins this period and ends this period in this year. And some people think it's problematic that we don't have an event, that we're going to use this 1299 date and count this way. But what he's doing is he's taking the 150 years and says 150 years ends on July 27th, even though there's no event there. Okay. So that's just kind of a quick review of those lines. And switch back here. Any questions about that?
No, not at this time.
Okay. Yeah, it should be pretty straightforward. In that, we've gone through these things at other times, and most of us are going to be familiar with Josiah Lich's prophecy.
The problem, I see one problem here.
Okay.
That both in 1449 and 1840, there are like symbolic events that are happening. So in 1449, there is a symbolic capitulation of the Byzantine Emperor. And in 1840, there is the opposite event, the symbolic capitulation of the Turkish Emperor, right? But then the actual event happens a few years later. So the actual historic, notable event happens a few years later. So not in 1449, but 1453, there is a violent attack on Constantinople and the fall of that city. And then in 1840, the notable event is 1844, right? The cleansing of the sanctuary and the starting of the seventh trumpet and so forth.
Yeah, you're talking about the periods of 4 years.
So why do we have this gap? I always wondered why there is this gap between the symbolic event and the actual event. What does it
Okay, so that's actually the point that we're going to look at today. We're gonna deal with these perceived problems, which I wouldn't know if I would call it a gap. That's not how I see it, but just hang on. I have to open up these documents here. So the question, if I'm going to try to rephrase it for people, is that the event that we mark is the fall of Constantinople in 1453, right? Mm-hmm. So that becomes the important event, as far as that's going to be the killing of Eastern Rome.
Yes.
Okay. And before that, they can hurt and not kill. But the event that happens in 1840 that marks the period of 391 years is going to be the submission of the Turkish Sultan to the four European powers.
Yeah, it's a symbolic event. It's similar to the capitulation of the Byzantine Emperor. So it's the opposite, similar but with the opposite sign.
Mhm.
1949. So it's a similar event but the opposite sign. This time it is the Turkish Sultan that capitulates. But then it's just symbolical. The actual event happened. The actual notable event happened a few years later. So that is 1844, the cleansing of the sanctuary. Right? This is the actual event.
Well, yeah, but this isn't addressing the cleansing of the sanctuary. This is addressing Islam. So, I mean, the actual event that's marked, that begins the 391 years and that ends the 391 years, is a mirror. So you have Constantine XI submitting to the four Turkish sultans, and then Turkey, the Turkish Sultan really, submitting to the four European powers. So even though you have this other event, the destruction of Constantinople, that it is 4 years is interesting in that it's 4 years also to the event in 1844 from the end of that period.
Yes.
But I don't know what you mean by symbolical
Yeah,
in
because
this context.
one of them is symbolical and is followed shortly after a few years by the real event.
But I don't know what you mean by real event. I mean, the real event for the prophecy is not the destruction of Constantinople
Yes,
or the cleansing of the sanctuary.
yes, these are the real events. These are the notable historical, the important events. What happened earlier, a few years earlier, is just a symbolic thing. So there's a symbolic capitulation that it shows, okay, something is going to happen a bit later, right? But it's just symbolical at that point.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word symbolical. It's a real event.
Yeah, it is real, but it has a meaning. So it's not important in itself, but it has a meaning that something else is going to happen soon, right?
Right. So we know that it's connected. I mean, it's connected. August 11th, 1840 is connected to October 22nd, 1844 by 1,533 days.
Of course.
Right? You understand what I'm saying about the 1533?
1533. Okay.
Yeah. So you're not familiar with that.
No, I'm not familiar. No.
Okay. Here, I'll go to the whiteboard again. So it's kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it'll be important here to just sort of, because you're bringing up a problem that I wouldn't actually look at as a problem. Yeah. So when we get to the end of this prophecy, which we haven't got to yet, August 11th, 1840. Ellen White says this is, I can't remember exact words, a wonderful manifestation of the power of God. She goes from 1840 to 1844. So you're going to have October 22, 1844. She's talking about this period of time, from the time that this prophecy is fulfilled to the end of the 2300 days.
Yes.
And she compares it to the Exodus. Now, the Exodus occurs in 1533 BC. Technically, actually, on April 26th, 1533 BC, that's going to be when they leave Egypt, the 15th day of the first month. This period of time here is 1533 days. So they are connected.
It's very interesting because it's like if we there is a period in Daniel of 1335.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
correct. And the other thing that we have is the symbol of 153. So this is the 153 fishes. This is the number of years that Miller added to Ussher's chronology, because even though Ussher's and Miller's chronologies are both incorrect, Miller had the 6,000 years here end in 1843 originally, and then of course in 1844. By adding 153 years, he added some to the period of the judges and other things that he did to get this extra 153 years from Ussher. So he had this as creation, which is wrong. But it was an interesting fact that there's this 153 fishes, and we use this as a symbol that they must prophesy again. And so this is also the 153 days in Samuel Snow's letters, from the writing of his first letter to the publishing of his last letter on July 18th. So this 153 and the 1533 and the 1335 all become symbols connected with a prophesying again. And in the 1335, of course, that's going to be the first disappointment that they come to. So when you come to April 18th at sunset, and you still maintain your faith through that period, then you're going to receive the midnight cry. So, but now you're addressing this other problem. And so just to kind of illustrate this, or what you would call a problem, which I don't quite understand it. So you have 1449, and then you're going to have 4 years. And in 1453, you're going to have the fall of Constantinople. Okay, so you have the fall of Constantinople, but that's not the event that's being marked in this prophecy, right? It's dealing with this event here in 1449.
Yeah, this event, the fall of Constantinople, is also very important.
Yeah, it is important. There's lots of events that are important, but the prophecy, the time period itself, is this time period.
Yes, the time
right
period.
So when it comes to the time period itself, it's not here that we mark, it's here that we mark.
Yes, the symbolic event appears on the.
But I don't know what you mean by symbolic. I don't like it being called symbolic.
1449 is symbolic, right?
Of what?
Symbolic of the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire, but the actual fall happens a couple of years later.
Yeah, I don't think it's symbolic of this event.
Yeah, one of them is symbolic and one of them is the actual. A couple of years later, we have the actual thing happening.
You must mean something different than symbolic to me, because this is not symbolic of this.
This is how I would interpret, and
yeah,
Josiah Leach also is interpreting in the same way, because it's symbolic, right?
Yeah, I don't, but it's not a symbol. This isn't a symbol of this.
Yes, it is.
This is an event that leads to this.
Yes.
But when I understand a symbol, that means the things that are here are symbolizing what's here. And I don't see that anything here symbolizes what's here.
Of course. When the Byzantine emperor does not have the strength to sit on his throne and he needs to ask for permission, of course, you see that something is wrong with that political entity, right, with that state. And definitely you see it a couple of years later, then, okay, it's going to fall, right? There's actual fall.
Yeah, well, I still wouldn't use the term symbolical. I guess you can, but I wouldn't. Because when I use the term symbolic, a symbol is a symbol. That is, you could take what happens here and create symbols, and those symbols then can be applied to this. But I don't know what symbols are here that you would then
Right.
applied literally here.
The symbol is that, you know, the Byzantine power is gone completely. So the
That's
Byzantine,
not a symbol.
yeah, it's a symbol, right? And then
How?
you see a couple of years later, the actual thing happened. Is that
Okay, but no, but see, a symbol is something like 553. That's a symbol,
okay?
right? So what would the symbol be here? You just can't say, well, because the Byzantine Empire is going to fall here.
Because
This,
if you don't study in detail, you know, the notable historical fact is the fall of Constantinople, right? You have to study in detail.
well, I understand that, but that doesn't make this a symbol. Because a
Right.
symbol is a symbol. Like, you understand what I mean by a symbol. When I say symbolic, there has to be something that is figurative that
Yeah.
occurs literally. And I don't see anything as a symbol, like a number or a city falling or anything like that, that I could apply here. So what is the symbol here?
The situation is a symbolic act of capitulation. So it's symbolic.
But this isn't capitulation here.
Yeah, it's actual conquest. It's actual, it's not capitulation. It's the thing that the Eastern Roman Empire ceases to exist at that point, you know, 1453. So it's the actual historical.
Well, yeah, we know that but this is not what the prophecy is about. So what happens here is that Constantine the 11th submits to the 4 Turkish sultans. How is that symbolical of this?
Of course, it is symbolical because when that happens, we see that the Roman Empire, the strength.
But what is the symbol? See, a symbol is something that's visual. It's something that you can see.
Yes.
Right? It's like a mark.
Yeah.
So I don't see the symbol here. I see that this leads to this. I just think you're using the word symbolical wrong.
So what exactly is the right word to use? And in 1840, it happens the same thing. It's a symbolic capitulation.
Okay, what's symbolic about 1840
so
that deals with October 22, 1844?
In 1840, the Turkish Empire did not fall, right? Continued to exist. But something happened that showed that, okay, the Turkish strength, the Turkish power is gone, right? It's symbolic, and it shows that.
Yeah, but it's not symbolical.
It is symbolic.
You keep using this word symbolical, but what is the symbol?
So did the Turkish?
I mean, you could argue that the 11th day of the 8th month is symbolical. So if you use this as a symbol, you could argue that in whatever it is, 1922, November 1st, which is the 11th day of the 8th month on the biblical calendar. That's when the Turkish Sultanate ends. And so you could argue that this date is a symbol of the fall of the Turkish Sultanate that occurs later. So there you have a symbol. So you could argue that is a symbol, but it's not a symbol of this.
For some reason, the prophecy is putting it in that way. So,
yeah, I know there's good reasons why it's done. I just don't like your use of the term symbolical. That's all because to me, a symbol is a number, a typology that occurs. There's nothing typical that occurs that represents this. This is just leading to this. That's a lot different than a symbol of this.
It's leading, yes. And it's very much a symbol of that. Yeah.
But okay, but what's the symbol? You're saying it's a symbol, but I don't know what the symbol is.
Because it's not an actual historic event. So if you study history, you have to look more. The first thing that you notice is 1453 is the first thing that stands out. And then you study it more in depth, more in detail, and you see, okay, there was something symbolical in 1449.
No, this isn't symbolical though. This is the event that marks the end of 150 years. That's Constantine the 11th.
Yes.
So this is not some symbolical event that marks the end of the 150 years. You don't quite understand what you're doing, because when you start saying this is symbolical, you're actually destroying all prophecy by saying that. You're actually destroying this whole prophecy. But I don't think you realize what you're doing by using the word symbolical, because this has to be real and actual. This is real and actual. This is not symbolical in that sense. The event that occurs here is Constantine the 11th. Now, the counting of the days is going to be here, 541. And that's because Lich appropriately sees that the first and second woe are part of a chronological structure, even though he didn't fully understand this, because he only partly understood it. And that's what we want to look at, is that this whole structure, if you say this is symbolical, the whole structure falls apart. That is, you would have to argue that nothing, since nothing happened on July 27th, 1449, and it was just a symbolical event.
Something happened, but it is a symbolical event followed by the actual event a couple of years later.
Okay, so you're not aware of a guy who was in this message and what he was doing with September 11th?
No, I don't know.
Okay, so what you're doing is exactly the same thing he was doing. And he was trying to destroy the September 11th in the same way that you're destroying this date. Because when you say it's symbolical, you're actually undoing it.
No, I'm not saying it's not valid. It's marked on the timeline. The timeline is valid, definitely. But the actual notable event happens a couple of years later.
Okay, but you're using the word symbolical. And if you just can set aside that word, you can agree that this event leads to this event, right?
Yes, it does lead.
So forget the word symbolical, because I don't think you realize what you're doing with that word.
So
Because if it's symbolical, it's not real.
it is real, but
Then it's not symbolical.
it's not important in itself. It's important in what it means. Right?
Yeah, but it doesn't. But
It's the meaning of it that is important.
okay, then what is the symbol that's here?
Well, the symbol is that the Byzantine power is gone.
But that's not a symbol.
Yeah, it's a symbol, right? When
How is it a symbol?
Byzantine emperor, you
But
know,
tell me, what's the symbolic nature of it? Like, a symbol is like a number
it's
or
symbolic
a person who represents something else.
because the
So,
Byzantine Empire,
okay, who is Constantine symbolizing then?
he's the new Byzantine emperor, right? And he's
Okay, but what is he? Okay, but who is he symbolizing?
he symbolizes the power of the Byzantine Empire, right?
No, he is the power of the Byzantine Empire. He's not a symbol.
He is the power, yes.
Yeah, so then he's not a symbol.
He's not a symbol himself, but when he is not able to sit on his throne, it's not an actual thing in itself, but you know, it says something, that something is happening over there. That this country is not gonna be around for much longer, right?
We know that. We all agree that this event leads to this event.
Yes.
I'm just saying that you can't have Constantine symbolize himself. So if you're going to have a symbol, you need to clearly be able to tell me what the symbol is. A symbol is like a representation of something else in a way that it's not the thing itself, right? I understand what you're saying, but you're just using the word symbol wrong. I'm not sure why you want to hang on to that word symbol. Can you just leave the word symbol? Can you just get rid of the word symbol in your vocabulary and describe it in some other way?
It's something that has a meaning, you know, it doesn't stand out in history books or in history, it doesn't stand out. It's not 1449 that stands out. It is 1453 that stands out.
Yeah, but that's a wrong thinking. That's a wrong thinking. And I'll tell you why. Because this is not about the fall of Constantinople. This date is about the 391 years and 15 days. So I understand what you're saying. You're saying that Constantinople falls here, and this is the historic event. But that's not what the prophecy is addressing. It doesn't actually address the fall of Constantinople, does it?
Yes, it does. That's the main thing there. The fall of Constantinople.
It doesn't give us a time for the fall of Constantinople.
It's the same way that August 11, 1840 relates to October 22nd, 1844. It's the same relationship.
Okay, that I don't understand. So how does this,
Relates to
how
that.
is this a type of this?
Of course, it is a type, yeah.
How?
So this is what we need to understand, right? It's
So
a
they're
very-
connected. We know they're connected.
Of course,
But but when you say it's a type,
yes.
how is it a type? Tell me what is happening here
It's
that is
symbolic.
typical of what's happening here.
Many people nowadays say, hey, what happened on August 11, 1840?
Okay, I'm going to leave this argument because you don't seem to understand what a type is. And I'm not trying to be hard on you. I'm just saying that when you use it that as a type, you have to be able to plainly say what the type is. So a type is a symbol that points to something else. There's nothing about August 11th, 1840 that is connected typically. That is, now originally, so here's the only argument you could use that it's a type. That originally when they looked for the fall of the Ottoman Empire, what did they think was going to happen when the second woe ended? What did the Millerites think was going to happen?
Well, Josiah Lish predicted the fall of Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and what happened in connection with it?
There's a symbolic event of capitulation, right? A symbolic act of
Okay.
capitulation. The Turkish Empire continued to exist. The Ottoman Empire continued to exist at that point. It didn't just.
Yeah, we know, but that's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, it is irrelevant because it was a symbolic act of capitulation that showed that the Turkish power is gone, was effectively gone at that point.
Mhm.
Indeed, if you look in history, you see that after 1840, the Turkish Empire became like the sick man of Europe or something. They lost their power and they were being artificially maintained by foreign interests, you know. But they lost their power after 1840. This is a historical fact. And in 1840, you had something symbolical, right? And the actual fall of the Ottoman Empire happened in 1922 after the First World War, right? As you
Right. Yeah. So, but when we're dealing with Bible prophecy, we don't care about what the world thinks about a prophecy. We care about what the Bible says about a prophecy. So we can't say that the Bible prophecy was actually fulfilled on November 1st, 1922.
No, but
So the prophecy itself was fulfilled
yes,
in a literal sense on August 11th, 1844, or August 11th, 1840, not in a symbolical sense.
With a symbolic event, yeah.
But no. So I have to disagree with you. So we're not going to discuss this point anymore. Okay. We're not going to continue saying that it's symbolical. Okay. So what we are going to say though, if you wanted to make the argument that it was symbolical, the Millerites believed that probation was going to close on August 11th, 1840. You're familiar with that idea, right?
No, I'm not familiar, no.
Okay, so that's what they were teaching prior to August 11th. They were teaching that when the Turkish Empire fell, that would be the date in which probation would close or shortly thereafter. Because they were looking for the seventh trumpet to sound and the third woe to begin when the Ottoman Empire fell. Right? So you're familiar with that idea?
Of course, the seventh trumpet started sounding in 1844, right?
Right, but they thought it was going to sound in August 11th, 1840. Right, because the sixth trumpet would end with the second woe, and the seventh trumpet would begin to sound. And so they expected all kinds of events to occur prior to the second coming of Christ. Because if you think about how we understand the end of time, you know, we got the close of probation and we have the 7 last plagues, and all these things are going to happen before Jesus comes back. And those ideas come from Millerite history. That is, the Millerites understood this as well. So they were looking for a close of probation prior to the second coming. And so they thought that probation would close on August 11th, 1840. So the fall of the Turkish Empire, to their minds, was a close of probation. Of course, it didn't occur. So you could argue, if I wanted to take your position, that there was an understanding that probation was going to close on August 11th, 1840, but it didn't close until 1,533 days later. So in that way, you could probably connect it, but we know that there was no close of probation on August 11th, 1840. That was one of the first times that they predicted a close of probation. And they continually predicted closes of probation all the way up to, that would have been October 12th, 1844 as a close of probation. Right, so they kept predicting closes of probation because they believed that probation had to close prior to Christ's coming. So that would be something in your defense if you wanted to look at it as a type. But I just don't think you're using the word typology or symbology correctly, because a symbol is a symbol. You know, like 9/11 is a symbol, the number 9/11. And I don't see what the symbol is in 1449 or the symbol is in 1840 that addresses the event 4 years later. It's true that those events lead to that.
It's not an actual historical event that stands out by itself, except by what it means, by what its significance is, and that is foretelling something else.
Well, because he becomes the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. But the time prophecy itself is not symbolical of what's going to happen. I understand what you're saying, right? I'm just picking at your word because I think that word can be misleading when you say that something's symbolical, when just because it leads to a certain event. They are connected. Nobody doubts that. But when you use the word symbolical, you have to be able to show what the symbol is, right? And so I'm just really picky about this because other people have done damage to this message by misusing the word symbolical. And I just think that you need to recognize that. So we're going to address that later on because we're going to address that when it comes to 9/11. Because some people put 9/11 as a symbolical event, that it's not actual.
It was also very, very actual, right? So thousands of people died at that time, right? Thousands of people died, and it was,
Yeah.
it was not symbolical, right? It was very real.
Yeah. I'm just very, very picky. I'm very, very picky about the use of words.
But how many people died in 1449? How many people died in 1840?
But that's not the point. It's not pointing to people dying, right? It's pointing to.
Because it's not an actual historical event.
Yeah, it is a historical event.
It is, and it's important by its significance, by its symbolic significance, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, we have to stop this because I'm not going to agree with you. I tell you, I just won't. Because I don't think you know what you're doing by using the word symbolical. But I don't want to offend you in any way. I just think that you're making a mistake by continually pressing this point. Because I understand what you're saying and I can agree with you, except in the word symbolical. I think you're using it wrong. That's all I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Okay, I have to think about it, but
okay.
What do you think? Because the question was like that. What do you think about this gap? Why do we see this gap of 4 years between?
But it's not a gap. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but the prophecy isn't pointing to that event. The prophecy is pointing to when the Turkish, when Constantine the 11th submits to the 4 Turkish sultans.
This is the point, because the important event happened 4 years later.
But that's not the important event for the prophecy. The prophecy is marking the submission of Constantine to the 4 Turkish sultans. That's the important event. In that prophecy itself, what's being marked as far as the timeline is concerned is that. Now you're saying, well, there's 4 years later. So there's a significance of the 4 years. And I would agree with you that they're analogous to the 4 years that happened from August 11th, 1840 to October 22nd, 1844. They are connected. So I'm not arguing they're not connected, that they represent each other, if you want to put it that way. But that doesn't make August 11th, 1840 a symbol of October 22nd, 1844. They are connected. And see, when we do this, we have to be really careful, because when we look in our line, we need to understand when things are symbolic and when they're not. Like our line, our entire line is symbolic. Just as Samuel Snow's letters are symbolic. Those are symbolic things. But you can't say August 11th, 1840 is symbolic. So you'll see what I mean as we go through this. This is an extremely important point that you brought up. And that's why I didn't just let it go by, right? And so I'm not trying to like put you down or say, you're wrong, in that sense. But I think that you don't quite understand what you mean by what you say. And that happens. Often we make that, if we're not aware of something, we don't know about it, right? So we can't see how it affects something. So this is a very important point. But we spent too much time on it already. We'll come back to it.
Yeah, okay, let's continue the study.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So when we look at, I open up my paper here dealing with 3 woes, and just going to some of my charts here. So this is the paper on the trumpets. That's what we're looking at. This period of 5 months, where we talked about the locusts, it also is the period in which, so I'm going to kind of sum this up. Here's this period, AD 908. So this is the 126 years. This is my division, the way that I did the 126 and the 391. Odilia switched it the other way, 391 and 126. And then we also have to address the loosing and restraint of Islam. So we addressed it a little bit. Let me see if I can jump ahead here. So we talked a bit about the restraint of Islam. Now, in our history, when is Islam restrained? Okay, it's at 9/11. No. How come it's restrained at 9/11? So here's the chart I want. So I put here, Islam is restrained at 9/11. Now, when is Islam loosed? Now, here on this chart, I put 1989, which I don't know if that's correct, but it was just something that I was experimenting with back in 2015. So we look at the first woe in 1299. Islam is restrained, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I put that Islam was loosed in 632. So why would I put Islam is loosed in 632? Remember, this is an old chart I did in 2015. That's why I have 629 for the 5th trumpet, but I put 609, 606 now. Well, why would I put Islam is loosed in 632?
Well, historically, they basically took over North Africa, up to Spain, to France nearly, and towards Persia.
Yeah.
They conquered a large area.
Yeah. And they established their religion. They built all kinds of mosques, took over all kinds of cities and territory, right? Now, but they are restrained in 632, are they not?
they're restrained in a sense from those who have the seal of God, from punishing them.
Yeah. Okay, right. So in 632, with Abu Bakr's command, they're going to begin their massive amount of conquest that's going to occur in that period of 150 years. That's going to end with the Treaty of Constantinople in 782, right? So they're kind of loosed, but they're also restrained. So back then in 2015, I was experimenting with this. What does it mean that something's loosed and something's restrained? And we touched on that a bit yesterday, because we touched on the idea that a loosening, the same word that's loosed in reference to Islam in Revelation 9, is also the same as unsealing, right? Remember that? Yeah, from yesterday. So we have this loosening and the sealing up of the book that is then going to be, there's going to loose the 7 seals. Well, that loosening is the same word that's used in reference to Islam being loosed. So back then in 2015, I'm trying to understand this loosening and restraining. What does it mean that something's restrained? Well, we can see in 1299, Islam is also going to be restrained. That is, it's going to be able to hurt, but not kill. So it's not until Islam is loosed in 1449 that it can then bring to the end Constantinople 4 years later, right? So this loosening is necessary in order for that prophecy to be accomplished, or the fulfillment of their goal to kill would be accomplished. And it's going to be accomplished right at the beginning of this 6th trumpet, 4 years after it starts. And now what happens during that period of 391 years and 15 days? How would we characterize the history of Islam after it conquers Constantinople specifically? Does anybody know the history of Islam from 1449 onward?
Well, they continue on into Europe, and they're basically reached to the besiege Vienna.
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of limit
Right.
where they go.
Yeah. So shortly after that, they reach the limit of their empire, and they're going to start a period of slow decline. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, which usually happens, an empire reaches its pinnacle, and then it really can't expand anymore, and the problems inward start to eat away at it. And so, I mean, the Ottoman Empire still exists, but it's slowly going to be deteriorating over a long period of time, about 360 years or so. You could even say longer if you want to go to 1922. But there is an event that starts the 6th trumpet, which I marked here as the loosening of Islam, because it had been restrained under that period of 150 years. So once it's loosed, it's then going to, we're going to have the second woe. And that second woe is going to be Islam reaching the height of its territory, but then this slow decline. Now, Islam is restrained on August 11th, 1840. Would we agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So we mark the restraint of Islam then, and we also mark the restraint of Islam on September 11th, 2001. Now, here in this one, you can see that I put the third woe. So this was just me back in 2015. So you have to forgive me for what I'm doing there. But I'm saying, well, maybe the third woe was Islam being loosed in 1989. Now, why would I put Islam being loosed in 1989?
That's when the Soviet Union withdraw from Afghanistan.
Okay, right? And does not that withdrawal, and of course, all of these sort of Islamic-based countries being freed from the Soviet Union, doesn't that lead to what happens at 9/11 in some ways?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so there's some validity to that now. But I don't know if I would necessarily now put that Islam is loosed in 1989. But we do know that Islam, even prior to 1989, is still an issue. First, it was with Iran, right? So in the 70s. So we had this Islamic terrorists around. In 1993, of course, we know that the first bombing of the World Trade Center occurred on February 26, 1993. But we know that Islam then is restrained on September 11th. But we put that the third woe arrives. So in this one, I'm putting the third woe in a sense, I guess, arriving at 1989, which I don't think I would do. But back then, that's the way I was trying to sort this through. So Islam is restrained at 9/11, but it doesn't have to have been loosed in order to be restrained necessarily.
Okay, I have a strange question.
Okay.
Is there any significance to the date of the initial bombing of the World Trade Center being roughly 150 years from the close of the 1335?
Okay, so the 1335, well, you're having the Jewish year 1843.
Right.
Yeah, and then you're going to go to 1993.
Both years are leap years.
Mm-hmm.
But since this is February, since it took place on February 26, 1993, was it actually in the year, the biblical year of 1993?
No, it was in the biblical year of 19. Yeah, so the biblical year, are you going to be counting fall to fall or spring to spring?
Well, it wouldn't matter either way, because if I'm right, this is coming just before the start of the biblical year of 1993.
Yeah. But you're counting then from the end of the biblical year 1843 to the start of the biblical year 1993. Now we also have connected the bombing of the World Trade Center to Waco.
All right.
Even though they're unrelated events, from the world's point of view, what's the significance of Waco?
Well, Tim McVeigh being upset with different things that were going on within the government, especially with what happened.
Yeah, so April 19th, when
Right.
Waco's burned down.
You're thinking
and
of
then-
Oklahoma?
Yeah, that's Oklahoma. So that's going to be later, but that's connected. Now, the reason I bring this up, so you brought up February 26th.
Right.
Is February 26th a fulfillment of Bible prophecy in the strictest sense? Do we have something that marks that date, for instance? But we do say it prefigures or is typical of 9/11.
Right.
Okay, which is where I finally settled onto is that it points forward to 9/11. Now, Waco, what do the shepherd's rod, what are they typical of? What are they symbols of?
They're more symbolic of the church.
Yeah, well, and they're really symbolic of this movement.
Well, see, you're going to the place that I thought, but I didn't want to step there yet.
Yeah, so they're symbolic of this movement. Well, Jeff pointed this out
Okay,
a number of times. So one is they're a counterfeit of this movement. What is it that David Koresh, Vernon Howell, what is it that Vernon Howell was claiming that he was doing? What is it that he wanted to show to the world?
I remember the event. I don't remember what he was wanting to show.
He wanted to show the seventh seal,
Okay,
right? So one of the things, if you look at Waco, they're very, very similar to our movement. They talk about a lot of the same verses. Very interested in Ezekiel 8 and 9, right?
okay,
They even make an application of Ezekiel's prophecy as well. And, because I studied quite a bit into Shepherd's Rod, I know quite a bit about their material. So they basically address almost everything that we do, but from a completely wrong point of view. That is, they are a counterfeit. And many Adventists, when we would talk about the 2520, they would always group us in with Shepherd's Rod. Kelly Ross, when he was disfellowshipped, was basically being accused of being a shepherd's rod. That was he didn't know anything about shepherd's rod, but that didn't really matter. So they become a symbol of this movement. Now, the fact that Waco's burnt down on April 19th, that becomes significant because that's also tied in with the 1335. It's tied in with the first disappointment. So there's lots of things that we could do with that movement, if you want to call it, or that event of Waco and the group, the Branch Davidians, that we could see that they're going to be typifying or prefiguring our movement, but they're not a fulfillment of prophecy in and of themselves. February 26, 1993 prefigures September 11th, 2001, because it's an attack on the World Trade Center. And it's the first attack on American soil by Islam. So that would be symbolic, but not real.
okay. So in this same line of thinking,
Yeah,
we have the attack on February 26th. We have the attack in Waco. We have the attack in Oklahoma by Tim McVeigh.
mm-hmm. And is that the next year? 1994? Or was it 2 years?
I'm not recalling.
I'm trying to remember. I think it was just a year later, but I could be wrong. 1994, 1995. I know it's one of those.
Okay,
Somebody will find it.
1995, 2 years
Okay,
later.
2 years later, okay. And the significance of 2 years later, what's the significance of that? Because that's why I wanted to know whether it was one or two.
I'm not putting the piece together.
Okay. Well, one is the explosives. So he used explosives at the Oklahoma City bombing, right? And what's the significance of explosives? Are they connected to Islam in any way?
Yes, they are.
Okay. So particularly where do we mark explosives with Islam? It's a trick question.
Yeah, I know.
Well, in the woes, wouldn't we put it at what happens under the second woe?
Right.
Right. So the first woe is suddenly and unexpectedly. The second woe is explosives. But we're going to see this when we start going through Jeff's notes, because we're going through all this stuff before we go into Jeff's notes that is addressing these things. And I chose to do it this way for a reason, because we're going to see that Jeff gets a whole bunch of things right, even though he doesn't have the knowledge that we have. So the 2 years is the period of 2 years from, can't think of the guy's name. So the guy who becomes the Sultan, and there's going to be 2 years from when, so from 1451 to 1453, there's 2 years marked in there.
I think it's Muhammad II.
Yeah, Muhammad. Yeah, I was thinking it was Muhammad II. Yeah, just couldn't remember. I knew Muhammad's in there. So Muhammad II. And what's the significance of it being Muhammad II? Is there any significance in that?
I would assume that there is, but I don't know what it is.
Well, we look at the end and the beginning, right?
Okay.
So we also have a doubling. So it's a symbol of the midnight cry. So we can connect all of these things that happened back in 1449. We can connect them to our history, both in the symbolical events of February 26, 1993, and April 19th, 1993, and April 19th, 1995. Because these are things that are prefiguring events that are going to happen on the bigger line. Right? So when something is symbolical, it's a symbol, right? So we can show that it's a symbol, but it's also prefiguring something else. So an example, when we go back to the Battle of Lake Champlain or the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 11th, 1814, is that symbolical?
Yes.
Okay. Now, why is it symbolical? What's the symbols that are presented there to William Miller? So we have the date September 11th, of course. But what else happens?
Well, the reality of the situation was this was the last, at that time, it was the last battle to occur on US soil with a foreign power.
Okay, so there's that. But we also know it was a great slaughter, right?
Okay.
So when you read William Miller's, and we're going to look at this actually in more detail later on, but when you read his letter that he writes, he's describing 9/11. The other thing that he notices is what? What is it that the thing that strikes him the most?
God's providence.
God, yeah, God's hand, right? Is God's hand involved in 9/11?
Definitely.
Yes. So we can see that even though September 11th, 1814 is not a prophetic event, it's not on a timeline, like it's not prophesied that it's going to happen on such and such a date or anything like that. He's prefiguring in the date and what he sees of 9/11, 2001. So and we can see the symbols quite clearly. He sees God's hand, there's the great slaughter, and also the date itself. And is there 2 years attached to that? Going back to the April 19th one.
Yes.
Yeah, because 2 years later, that's when he begins his study of the Bible, because of they're going to celebrate, going to have a ball, right, on September 11th, 1816. But because of the preaching that was done in the service on that date, they decide not to have the ball. They cancel it. And instead, Miller begins his 2 years of study that he completes in 1818. So there's a 2 years there. So these are important symbols that we can then later apply to the actual events, correct?
Okay,
Right? 1993, February 26, 1993 is symbolic, but it's not an actual event. Actual events can be symbolic of other events, right? So August 11th, 1840 is symbolic of September 11th, 2001. They're connected because we can run them in parallel lines. So, this is in response to Christian's comments there. So we can see that there are some things that we have to be very, very careful about, because we need to know what it is we're doing. That is, we have to be very clear on how we're understanding prophecy. And when we go and we look at this Josiah Litch's prophecy, and even when we dealt with Ezekiel's prophecy, all of these different prophecies of Scripture lay out the principles on which we used to make our July 18, 2020 prediction. What ended up happening is that most of the people who were involved in supporting that prediction, let's say, they didn't make it, but they supported it, they fell away. And why did they fall away? I mean, there's obviously, spiritual reasons, but I mean, just from a interpretive point of view. What is it that they were doing?
misapplying.
Misapplying, right? So even when they were supporting July 18th, the thing that bothered me the most is that people were making misapplications of Scripture, making misapplications of interpretation, thinking that this was supporting July 18th, when in fact they were undermining the very prediction they said they believed in. So when it came to the point of rejecting July 18th, they rejected it upon a basis that was false. That is, they used their misinterpretations of Scripture as the reason we couldn't have predicted July 18th. But they didn't understand the prediction at all. They didn't understand the prophecies. And I'm not sure that we still do. That is, I still see some of that residue existing in our understanding of July 18th. So people think that because they accept July 18th, that means that they understand it. But I would say that most people don't understand it. And because they don't understand it, because it's not the way that they create it in their own minds is detached from the Old Testament prophecies. That is, they do it in a sense kind of with numerology. That is, they see some of what I would call the tertiary arguments that we made for July 18th as the main arguments. But the main arguments themselves, they've completely ignored. And they continue to act and operate in their understanding of what's happening in the world today incorrectly. And the same thing happened in Millerite history, because that's when we studied early writings, page 74. What did we find about the people in Ellen White's day in 1850? What were they doing in 1850 and 1851? They accepted October 22nd, 1844. I'm talking about the people who accepted October 22nd,
Right.
1844. What were they doing that was wrong?
There was a lady that was going to Old Jerusalem.
Okay, so you had people going to Old Jerusalem. Yeah. And so that was basically a total denial of the message of Miller, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay, but yet they were doing it, thinking that they were accepting October 22nd, 1844, but yet they were going to be going to Old Jerusalem. Completely contradictory to the message of Miller. They also were time setting. What was the problem with time setting?
They were attempting to reinterpret Bible prophecy.
Okay, yeah, so they were going to reinterpret the prophecies. And so that means they didn't accept their interpretation, even if they accepted October 22nd, 1844 in words. The fact that they were looking for a time after 1844 meant that they didn't understand 1844 at all. So we have all these different things happening within the movement back in 1850. And those same things are happening today. That is, we're not understanding how to interpret prophecy. Here's an example. The pandemic. Is it a type or is it a reality? That is it a type of the Sunday law or is it the Sunday law?
It's a type of the Sunday law.
Okay. Now, some people will even say it's a type of the Sunday law, but they actually teach that it is the Sunday law. How do they do that?
Well, they're making a misapplication.
Yeah, they're making a misapplication. So if you say that the pandemic is a test, receiving the vaccine is a test, that if you receive the vaccine, you're lost, is that a misapplication?
Yes.
Right. Now, we can say the vaccine's not a good idea. People shouldn't be taking it. We can all agree on that. But we can't attach to it a close of probation, because that's what you would be doing.
Okay, so in these three events,
Yeah.
the bombing at the World Trade Center in 1993,
Mm-hmm.
the attack at Waco,
Yeah.
and then 2 years later, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something we can draw from this pattern? I mean, I'm looking at it and questioning the situation as I initially offered, because this was, in a way of looking at it, 150 years from the close of the 1335.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also intriguing to me that the day that Timothy McVeigh was put to death was 91 days prior to September 11, 2001.
Okay. Which is 91 is.
Haven't we addressed 91 in the past
Yeah.
as having some symbolism within the movement?
Yes, and it's also 13 times 7.
Okay,
Right.
right.
So it's the number of rebellion times the number of perfection.
So were the ones putting him to death the ones in rebellion?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't like to use Timothy McVeigh as a good symbol.
I'm not
But
using
we're
him as a
using
good-
Waco as a symbol of this movement. So there is some connection.
Okay,
But it, it's a counterfeit, but it does symbolize this movement. And so we would have to connect Timothy McVeigh to that as well. I don't have it all sorted out, but you can see what I'm saying by something being a symbolic, but not actual. And when you look at the pandemic, we know it's a type of the Sunday law, but it's not the Sunday law itself. It's leading to it as well. So we can see that what's happening now is leading to the Sunday law. It's a consolidation of power. And it's leading to tyranny. So we can all agree on that. And we also have it within a typical line because our line is typical. It's a symbolic line, just as Snow's letters are, because remember, we're repeating Snow's history. And so July 18th lines up with July 18th, 1844, the last of Snow's letters. And it's part of a structure of 153 days. But there's also another structure that was fulfilled in our history. So we have lots of pieces of the puzzle to put together. And not all of us are familiar with all the pieces. That is, we may know a little bit about them, but we haven't put them all together. And that's what I think we have to do here. And what we're going to do is we're going to finish off Josiah Litch's prophecy. So we've jumped way ahead, mostly because, Christian bringing up what he thought about 1449. But we're going to finish off this prophecy. We're going to go through and establish this prophecy in and of itself without addressing July 18th yet. So that's what we're planning to do. And then what we're going to do is we're going to study what Jeff says about it. And then that's going to lead us to looking at 9/11. And then to look at our line. And then when we look at our line in a lot more detail, especially what happened in connection with the 777 days, and also the 391 days and 126 days, all of these different symbols that come from Josiah Litch's prophecy and other prophecies, Ezekiel's prophecy. Then when we put these together, we should see that this structure is sound. But we need to understand where we are and when we are. Because with Jeff, the mistake he made, if you want to say it's a mistake, it's the same mistake that Miller made, is he didn't understand exactly when he was. He was looking for the second coming of Christ, Miller was. And Jeff was looking for the completion of the temple and the lifting up as an ensign God's people. But yet he misapplied it. At least he didn't understand all of the symbols and what they were pointing to. Even though on our lines, we could clearly see that we were Samuel Snow's letters and that we weren't the whole seventh month movement and that we weren't on the big line, that we were the priests. And so this was confusing to people. But just like Miller and the others, when they saw the dates approaching, they set aside some of their interpretations, like November 9th. We just set it aside, said, Omega is wrong about November 9th. None of these events are going to happen. And yet, how did we fit that in? How did we address Raphia and Panium? But we have to say that November 9th was Raphia and July 8th was Panium. But on which line? What does November 9th line up with, and what does July 18th line up with? It's a trick question.
So one of these being on the big line, one of these being on one of our lines.
Okay, so if we look at Millerite history, would we not line up November 9th with April 19th and July 18th with October 22nd?
We can.
Okay, and that's what we did. So that's what Daniel Fontenot does. And we all do it because we recognize that there's two disappointments we have in our history, November 9th and July 18th. And the group that fell away with November 9th was the Omega. Those are the ones that didn't accept the midnight cry. They didn't accept the chronology, right? And then you have July 18th lining up with October 22nd. But we also know that July 18th lines up with Samuel Snow's letters. So when we look at this movement, we would have to say that the July 18th prediction is more connected with Samuel Snow's letters. Samuel Snow's letters were symbolic of the bigger line in his history. That is, July 18th is a symbol of 187. October 22nd is the 10th day of the 7th month. The 10th day of the 7th month is the 187th day of the Jewish year. So Samuel Snow has within himself, within his history, his letters, and then the history that he participates in when he makes his prediction. And so the same division or distinction also exists within this movement itself. That is, we have a bigger line, and that bigger line has a Raphi and a Panium as well, correct?
Right.
But yet we still continue to have these smaller lines that are wheels within wheels of bigger lines. But the big line itself, we're not even to midnight, right? We're not even to the loud cry. We're going to see that as we go through this, where we think we're farther along than we really are. But it doesn't mean that those events are far off. It just means, because we're approaching those events. Because the big line, the next event is the Sunday law, connected to the image of the beast test, right? In Ellen White's line, the next thing after October 22nd, 1844 is the Sunday law. She doesn't have a midnight and a midnight cry that precedes the Sunday law, correct? She does. That's the midnight and midnight cry in Millerite history.
All right.
So on the big line, Ellen White sees October 22nd, 1844, and then she sees the Sunday law, and then the loud cry, and then the close of probation. That's the line that she has. But we looked at Millerite history and saw that we could take midnight and the midnight cry and place them before the Sunday law, because we could line the Sunday law up with October 22nd, 1844. And we still, in this movement, I don't think people understand what we're doing. That is, what Jeff was doing. And we're going to get to that. So once we get through all these things, so I'm just kind of giving you a preview of what we're going to do. Once we get through all this history of Josiah Litch's prophecy and how it connects to our history, then we will see why Jeff did what he did in attaching the things he did to July 18th. And it wasn't wrong in the sense that he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do. But there's a reason why it happened. And he could have seen it, that we are on a typical line, that the priests and the Levites are not the big line, that they're typical of the big line. So the big line is the real event. The Sunday law, in a sense, when Ellen White's talking about the angel of Revelation 18, is she talking about 9/11? Or is she talking about the Sunday law?
Sunday law.
She's talking about the Sunday law. It's really clear that that's what she's talking about. But yet, we attach it to 9/11. So we need to understand what 9/11 is in the big line and how it's attached to the big line. And that still, even though I presented it many times, I don't see that people generally understand it. There might be a few people that understand it, but we generally don't in this movement understand what 9/11 means, because 9/11 is part of a repeat of history. It's August 11th, 1840. but it's also the arrival of the second angel. And people don't understand why that is, why Jeff did that in the first place. So I know we jumped around a lot of things, but it was a good study, in my view. Now, Christian, are you sort of happy with what we're doing here?
Yes, I'm happy. I think all of this makes sense. I have, of course, I have more questions, but okay, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, and so, and I apologize for how I treated you.
No,
Yeah, it's, I don't like to sort of sound like I know what I'm doing. I like to usually be a little more involved and lead people through something, but sometimes I think it's important to just do what I did, even though I don't like doing it, because I don't want to offend anybody. But I do think that once we start to look at this in more detail, we will understand the relationship of all these different dates and events and how they're tied together with our history. And if we do some of the mistakes that the Millerites did, because they made lots of mistakes, and I don't know how much you followed what they did with Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45.
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
Yeah, so we went through that. I mean, and what they dealt with is how they dealt with the history of Islam leading up to August 11th, 1840, and how they saw that. I mean, they made lots of mistakes, lots of breaking of Miller's rules in their application. But it was understandable they did so because they believed that Jesus was coming back in 1843. And so in order to kind of piece this together, I know it's a rather complicated puzzle. And so I'm trying to do the best I can. But I think you'll see once we start going through, especially when it comes to the events and in connection with the sixth trumpet or the second woe, in how we divide up this 391 years and 15 days and the various dates that show up, you'll start to see how Litch uses this prophecy unwittingly. He doesn't even realize what he's doing, and how it establishes all kinds of principles to understand dates and spans of time. So that's what we're going to try to start on tomorrow. So we're going to start tomorrow. We'll go through the second woe. That's at least my plan. I was kind of going to do that today, but we'll go through the second woe and set that up. And then the week after, we will sort of complete that. And then we're going to go through Jeff's notes. So before we even get to the last part of this, we're going to just go through Jeff's notes dealing with these trumpets and woes. So it's going to kind of be a review. And we'll see where Jeff picks up on things that he doesn't even realize he picks up on, that we now notice. So we'll pick things that he doesn't really notice what he's saying, but he's just following Bible prophecy. Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for each person who watches these videos and participates in them. I pray, Lord, that our words and the way that we treat one another will be in accordance with your spirit, with the way that Christ would speak and talk. And help us, Lord, to truly love one another as we love you and as you love us. We ask, Lord, for continued help in these studies. We know that this is a difficult studies to present, and it's difficult to understand. There are many, many details. And help me, Lord, as we continue through in the next few weeks to really understand these things. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.